Sayyidina Muhammad wa ala ali Sayyidina Muhammad wa barak wa sallim. So the topic that was suggested for today's evening's talk is this idea of zuhud. If you look at the word zuhud in the Arabic language, linguistically, it means to be disinterested in something, what we call admur raghaba, that it doesn't really mean a lot to you. It doesn't hold any particular significance to the individual. And that's why you see in Surah Al-Yusuf, when the brothers of Yusuf alayhi salam had made their plot and cast him in the well, and when he was drawn out by a caravan, قَالُوا يَا بُشْرَى هَذَا غُلَامٌ, they were pretty amazed that no, they were going to get some water, and instead they found a child, which they were going to sell into slavery, but they didn't make a big deal out of him. Right? They didn't um, honor him. They didn't value him the way that he should be valued. They didn't appreciate his beauty. They didn't appreciate his maqam with Allah. He was going to be a nabi, and they didn't appreciate any of his talents. Right? He was going to be the minister of economics in the future, and in the minister of finance for the nation in the future. Well, so when the Quran talks about how those people who they utterly undervalued and underassessed his value, and the Quran says, وَكَانُوا فِيهِ مِنَ الزَّاهِدِينَ, that they were zahid, people of zuhd, with regards to him, meaning he didn't really matter to them. That's why they actually sold him off. وَشَرَوْهُ بِثَمَنٍ قَلِيلٍ, and they didn't even sell him for that much money because it wasn't something that they had a value for. So that's one linguistic usage of the word zuhud, right? That to be disinterested. Another way that the word zuhud is used in the Arabic language is to refer to something that is very little, right? When you say something is, there's different ways to say this in the Arabic language. You can say shay'un qalil, right? Very few, a little thing. And each one of these different words have a different subtle connotation. You can say shay'un yasir, right? It's very easy, but we wouldn't translate it as easy, meaning that it's sort of insignificant. Or you can say shay'un zahid. And shay'un zahid also means to be very little. And because it's little, that's why a person doesn't take any particular interest in it. Now, in the Sharia and in the Deen, when we use the word zuhd, and when we talk about the concept of zuhd, this refers to having a disinterest in the dunya, right? The particular ascription of this admur raghaba, this lack of interest to the dunya, that is referred to as zuhd in the deen. And this is zuhd matlub. This is the zuhd that is desired and that is asked from the Muslimin. That does not mean, right, that you cannot own the dunya, because there's many great scholars, there are many great mashayikh who are even wealthy. That's not what, and oftentimes when we think about zuhud, that's what comes to people's mind. That, you think about the faqir, and you think about the beggar, or you think about the person who lives in utter squalor. Um, Being a person of zuhud doesn't mean that you cannot have the dunya, but what it requires is that your heart should not be attached to it. In other words, it's not that you can't own the dunya, but you have to make sure that it doesn't own you. A person who has zuhud, the things of the dunya don't really move the individual. They don't capture their attention. The person doesn't have expectations in the dunya. Person doesn't have long hopes and long desires and long plans about what they're going to acquire and accumulate and create for themselves in the dunya, because they're not about that. Like think about, and all of us have zuhd in different things. Right? If a person, for example, were to come here and start talking about something that we have no attachment to, right, we would very quickly become bored. A person who's really into basketball You take him to the golf course, he's going to get bored. So that person has zuhd when it comes to golfing. You take most, 13-year-olds and you put them in a halaqa, they might get bored. And so they have a certain level of zuhd when it comes to the deen. And that's really a travesty because there's a general apathy that exists within the ummah. When Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has asked us really to have zuhd with the dunya, people have misappropriated that concept and that quiddity of disinterest and reassigned it to their dunya. To their deen. So much so that people, like, if you say that we're going to, have a get together where we're going to do the dhikr of Allah. How many people are going to show up? If you're going to say that we're going to start a class, how many people will show up? But if there's a bazaar, if there's a, football game, if there is, a music event, people will come out in droves. And the proof is in the pudding, right? You just follow the stats when it comes to things like what are the type of websites that get the most hits. And all of them, right, almost without exception, have to do with the entertainment industry. So this is the general direction, the general current that the entire world is going towards, and Muslims are being swept away with that same current. And while we're making that example of a current, it might be a good segue to give one simple example to understand what the balance is and what the concept of zuhud is in Islam. And I believe it was Sheikh Ashraf Ali Thanwi who also gave this example initially, where he compared it to being like a boat. Right? A person who exists in the world exists in the world but doesn't exist for it. And the parable that he struck was that of a boat, and a person is sitting in the boat and trying to cross a body of water, say a river or a lake or an ocean. Now, the boat has to remain in the water if it's going to float. It has to traverse the water. It has to get to the other side. If it's not existing within the water, it's not going anywhere. In the same way, we don't have this concept of monasticism or becoming a monk in Islam. The Sufi is not the person who cuts himself out from the entire world, gives away all his belongings, and goes and sits in the corner of the masjid and just does the dhikr of Allah. Right? That's not the concept of Islamic piety. And the Prophet ﷺ made this very clear. La rahbaniyata fil Islam, that there is no monasticism, there is no monkhood in Islam. This is and a lot of these ideas of what it means to be super righteous, what it means to be super pious, what it means to be dispossessed of the dunya, for one reason or another, what exists in the popular imaginary of individuals is sometimes derived from Christendom, believe it or not, because it is those same constructs that permeate, and those same motifs and themes that permeate, popular conceptions in the media, and in different types of movies and um, different forms of art, about what it means to be saintly, what it means to be pious. So, but that's not the Islamic conception, and you see that in the person of the Prophet Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam. He was the ultimate example of Zuhud, where he lived the full gamut of the human experience. Right? He was a teacher, he was an army leader, he was a head of the state, he was a father, he was a husband, he was, he mended his clothes, he was a businessman. He did everything. He did it all. But that wasn't what he lived for. And so we live in the dunya, right? And so the boat has to go in the water, but a person has to be very careful to not let the water come into the boat. Because, and if there's any water that actually starts to come into the boat, then they have to bail water. Because if too much water comes into the boat, then the person drowns. And this is what is the situation of the ummah to a great degree, that there's an intense and tremendous amount of greed that exists within people. People really like to complain and rail against and talk about these high and lofty ideals of social justice, and causing in the wealth gap, and creating equality when it comes to capital distribution of monies. But the funny thing is that the people who are really, the loudest voices sometimes in that arena are the people who are the have-nots. And if you were to put those same people in the situation as the people who have wealth, right? Because a very small number of people have more wealth than 80% of the world, right? If you were to take the top 40%, maybe 40 billionaires, or in the world, they probably have more wealth than perhaps even entire countries, and definitely more than likely more than 80% of the lower tier of the entire world. So now people rail against that, but if those same people were put in those same situations, then they tend to recapitulate the same type of behavior. And it's the same idea of absolute power corrupting absolutely, and just the draw of money and the draw of wealth and the desire that goes within it. And it's like a black hole, right? There's very few people who can escape. And so the person who's perspicacious, and the person who's sagacious, the person who's wise, is going to be very careful not to let holes come into his boat so that water can seep in from underneath, and try to avoid the waves so that water doesn't get into their boat from above, because otherwise they literally will be drowning in the dunya. And this is something that we're bombarded with from every single type of direction, and it actually requires an active effort. There's actually two types of things that in the deen that we've been told not to guard our gaze from, and one of them is people are very familiar with, right? We've been told to guard our gaze from the opposite gender. قُل للمؤمن in Surah An-Nur, بعد أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم قُل للمؤمنين يغضوا من أبصارهم ويحفظوا فروجهم, that tell the believing men to lower their gaze, وَيَحْفَظُوا فُرُوجَهُمْ, and that they should guard their chastity and their private parts. And in the next verse, وَقُلْ لِلْمُؤْمِنَاتِ يَغْضُضْنَ مِنْ أَبْصَارِهِنَّ وَيَحْفَظْنَ فُرُوجَهُنَّ, and tell the believing women to lower their gaze, yani from the opposite gender. And this is also sort of a forgotten art, right? How few individuals do you actually find in this day and age that are actively, guard their gaze from the illicit glance. So that's one thing, and this is something that so what the human being is being told to guard their gaze from is something called jamal, right? Something of beauty. And this is obviously in the context of the verse is directed against the opposite gender, but it's you can take it as a more, you can expand it, right, in its meaning to more general things, zahrat al-hayat dunya, to the beauty of the things of the dunya. Because if you spend too much time, flipping through the pages of Cosmo, or flipping through the Instagrams where everyone has perfect bodies and perfect noses and perfect faces and perfect lives, that creates a tremendous amount of discontent within the individual. If you flip through endless houses on the internet, endless cars on the internet, endless clothes on the internet, the thing that creates is that it's just a person is purposely poking holes in their boat, and they're just literally filling their heart with the dunya. And there's individuals who can actually feel that, right? And we don't feel it because we're just drowning in it, right? We're just swimming in the ocean. But if you get all that water out, and then you feel, and you let a little bit of it come in, then you actually feel the wetness, right? And that's why, and you have to, it's in that context that we understand statements of the likes of Imam Nawawi, rahimullah, who said that, now this was an individual. I mean, you understand his zuhd. He never even got married, right? Because he was so dedicated. And that's a whole different discussion about that. But he said that when I undertook the study of, he said, in one book it comes that al-ilmu ilman, ilmul abdan wa ilmul adyan, that knowledge is of two types: knowledge of the bodies and the knowledge of religion. And when he was talking about knowledge of the bodies, and this is I think in the Ta'lim al-Muta'allim of Imam Zurnuji, if I remember correctly. So he said that so there's basically medicine and religion, right? These are the two great sciences. But Imam Nawawi, rahimullah, he said that, when I undertook the study of medicine, I noticed a new darkness enter into my heart. How do we understand that when we live in a community of physicians, right? Does that mean that it's haram to become, na'udhu billah, a physician? No, it doesn't mean that. It was an experiential thing that he felt when you live uh, in such a guarded, in such a pure environment, right, where you're high and dry, that even when a little bit of water comes in, you'll feel it, or you feel the wetness. And that was the same thing that one time my teacher had said to me. I still remember. He said that it's going to be my job to get you out of medicine and into the madrasa, and then it'll be my job to drag you out of the madrasa and put you back into medicine, because when you're in that environment, right, it's just like you're flying in the clouds, right? You don't want to come back, but there is this need, coming back to the same idea, that we don't live in ivory towers, right? We live in real life, and still remain connected to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. That is the challenge. And this is the way that the Prophet ﷺ used to be. That he used to, like I said, he lived the full experience of humanity experientially, but then his attitude towards it was that he it didn't mean anything to him. Ibn Umar radiallahu an, he said that the Rasul says one time he grabbed him by his shoulders and he said, "Kun fi dunya ka'annaka gharib aw abiri sabil." That being in the dunya as if you're a stranger, or you are like a person who's just passing through the way, like a wayfarer. And in another place, "Mali ulid dunya ukam aqal." Like, what is with me in this dunya? He didn't have that connection, and he was so disconnected um, with it, that was why it was so easy for him to give it all away. In fact, he couldn't. There's many people who can't sleep at night because they're worried about, and their bank accounts are full. There's food in the fridge, all of that, but they have this anxiety about poverty. Right, that's what drives them to go to work every single day. The Prophet ﷺ had the opposite problem. Right, he didn't not go to sleep because he was worried about poverty. He couldn't go to sleep because he was worried about wealth. And there was one night where he literally could not go to sleep because he couldn't rest because he had 7 dirhams or something of the like at home. And it wasn't until he went home and took that and he gave it away in charity that he was able to be at peace. And then the next day he relied on Allah. Right, it's like the bird. Every day Allah provides for it a new risk. In the same way, He provides for people as well. And it was the same lack of want that was so moving to people, because he existed in a society which, even though at some level was poor, human beings in general are generally driven by money. They say that if you want to understand the world, right, you say that most of it is driven by um, politics. uh, what is no Most of the world is driven by religion, and most of religion is driven by politics, and most of politics is driven by big business. So if you want to understand why people are doing something, just follow the money trail, right? Look for the bottom line. And that's just, I mean, you could say to a certain level normal human nature, but it also speaks of our own spiritual and moral depravity. um, and this is what made the Prophet ﷺ stick out in the entire annals of human history, because he was completely divorced from this desire for things. He was the real deal. And he would give away so generously and so fearlessly that it would move people to come to Islam just because of that, because it's so abnormal. I mean, how many people have you met in your life that just don't care? I just don't fear. And one of the individuals where he gave him so much wealth that went back to his people and he said, "Oh, people, accept Islam, because this is a person who gives without fear of poverty." And this is the way the Prophet ﷺ lived his entire life. If you look at from the time when he was an orphan child in the middle of the desert to the time that he became the king of Arabia, where was the change in his lifestyle, right? Where was the upgrade? And his poverty, al-faqru fakhri, that his poverty was his pride. He actually used to make dua for this, and it really struck me because one time, like when you go to the haram, it's obviously a very spiritual place, and that's the place where you go and you make duas. But it really struck me because there's a collection of one of the mashayikh called Munajat Maqbul, which has these amazing duas in there. Very moving. And when you go through those du'as of the Prophet ﷺ, you really get into the psychology of the Prophet ﷺ. And I remember reading through it and being moved. But there was this one point, one of the du'as that's narrated there was a du'a that asked for poverty. And I remember hitting that and not making that du'a because I wasn't ready for it. Right? It's hard. We cling, right? We clench onto the dunya because we dig our nails into the dunya because we're so entrenched in it, and we literally have to be dragged, right, to get disconnect from it. Is really really hard. And imagine how the Prophet says, not only was he, one thing is being okay if poverty hits you, right? That's different. But when he would make a dua, Allahumma ahyini miskina wa amitni miskina wa واحشرني مع زمرة المساكين أو كما قال رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم, like make me live poor and let me die poor, let me be raised amongst the poor. um, and when we talk about this disconnection with the dunya, I want to be clear, this is not just about things, it's not about just houses and cars, and nice shoes and nice clothes. It's everything. الدنيا حلوة خضرة. The dunya is sweet and is verdant, it's green. All the glamour, all the glitz, all the fame, even the things, all the desire, even things like our own laziness, our procrastination, our lack of discipline. All of these things are things of the dunya. And that's why it comes in narration that حب الدنيا رأس كل خطيئة وكما قال رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم, that the love of the dunya is at the root of every sin. If you look at any sin that we commit in our life and you were to trace it back, it's because our love for the dunya beat out our love for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala at some level. That we ascribe for, we aspire for, we long for, we yearn for some type of principle over the principle of the deen. So I was speaking earlier about in the deen, we're told to keep our eyes away from two things. So one of the things I mentioned was what? Jamal, right? And the opposite gender. But the other one that people don't talk about, وَلَا تُمُدَّنَّ عَيْنَاكَ عَنْهُمْ وَلَا تُمُدَّنَّ عَيْنَاكَ إِلَى مَا مَتَّعْنَا مِنْهُمْ أَزْوَاجًا مِنْهُمْ, that do not extend your eyes, right? Longingly extending your eyes to what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has given to the people of the dunya. Um, what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has given to the people of the kuffar. Don't get beguiled by their Lamborghinis. Don't get beguiled by the fact that they have that many likes. Don't be like those people that say ya layta mithli ma utiya that, oh, we wish that ma utiya, that we were given the like of what was given to Qarun, right? Because he was wealthy, and people would look at that and they would want that, right? There was this deep desire that I want that lifestyle. And there's so many people who are living out scripts in their life which are completely fed to them from the outside. There's not the script of the Quran, and it is not the script of the Sunnah. I can guarantee you that. So we're told to actually guard our guys, so no, our gaze from that. So some people have understood that we need to guard our gaze from the opposite gender, but how many people actually guard their eyes from the dunya? And there was this one sister who, I mean, it's almost a decade ago, who used to come to halaqas when I used to be in St. Louis. And I remember, I think maybe in one of her email communications or something, she said that, I'm working on myself, that when I even go to the store, that I try to not look at, the clothes and those type of things, because she was actually trying to protect herself from her eyes, and lower her gaze from the dunya, so that love of that dunya doesn't come into her. So two things not to look at. And then we've been told to keep our eyes and to keep our gaze and our focus on one thing. When Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says in the Quran, وَاصْبِرْ نَفْسَكَ مَعَ الَّذِينَ يَدْعُونَ رَبَّهُم بِالْغَدَاةِ وَالْعَشِيِّ يُرِيدُونَ وَجْهَهُ وَلَا تَعْدُ عَيْنَاكَ عَنْهُمْ تُرِيدُ زِينَةَ الْحَيَاةِ الدُّنْيَا. And this is a command to the Prophet ﷺ, that stay with these people, with these righteous people, with these righteous Sahaba, these were people, the Ashabu Sufa. These were people who lived mired in poverty and squalor, and all they had was Allah and His Messenger. And the Prophet and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala said, stay with these people. If you want to fix وَلَا تَعَدُّ عَيْنَاكَ عَنْهُمْ, and don't turn your gaze away from them. Keep your gaze on the faces of the awliya. Keep your gaze on the faces of the sulaha. Keep their company. And when you do that, this inherently automatically, organically creates an element of zuhd within the individual. Now, Zuhd has its own levels. Imam Ahmad bin Hanbal, he actually said that there's actually three types of Zuhd. One type of Zuhd is the Zuhd of the awam. This is the Zuhd of the general people. And this is abstention from the things which are haram. Now, it's really sad that the situation now is that most people can't even exercise the Zuhd of the awam in the general populace today. And then there's a second level of zuhud, which is zuhud aniz zawaid, that's staying away from things which are extra, meaning these are things which are permissible, but you're staying away from it because you are disinterested in it. And one of the reasons that you're disinterested in it is because you become interested in something else. ما جعل الله لرجل من قلبين في جوفه. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has not created two hearts within individuals. You have one heart and one love. And when a person fills their heart with the love of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, it pushes out the love of the dunya. Right? Those two things are sort of, they're like polar opposites, and one repels the other. The more that a person fills their heart with the love of the dunya and the things of the dunya and of physical beauty, the less they can appreciate the things and matters of the heart and the soul. You take a person who's really mired into music, they're not going to enjoy listening to Quran. You take a person who's mired into frivolity, they're not going to appreciate, and technology and video games, they're not going to appreciate nature and the qudra of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. They won't be able to see those signs in the creation. You take a person who is all they think about is the opposite gender, and they're gonna find prayer difficult because their heart is stuck in all the wrong things. And this is a concept which is very well understood to the masha'af of the past. In fact, there's this one story that comes to mind right now about a person who came to a sheikh for his rectification. So when he came to the sheikh asked him, "What do you love the most?" And he said, "Oh, I love such and such black cow of mine." So he said, "Okay, you love that cow. Why don't you do this? Why don't you go and make muraqabah, right? Just make dhikr of that cow, or just contemplate about the cow, meditate about the cow." I mean, what type of sheikh is that? But just hear me out, because you'll appreciate what he was doing. So he sent the student to go and just meditate about the cow, right? And he would just meditate about this cow and meditate about this cow until the cow became like everything, right? It filled his field of vision. And then when the sheikh saw that it had like filled up his heart, then he said, take the cow and slaughter it. And when you slaughtered the cow, there was nothing left. And nature abhors a vacuum. And so the only thing that was left was Allah. Right? Then the person came on to deen. And I've seen this before with other individuals, right? That, a person, for example, the thing that's keeping them away from Allah is maybe, dating. So, they're doing the dating thing. Something happens, they find out that, it's not all that is cracked up to be. They get bit by the dunya, and they're like, you know what, I've had it. I'm not messing around like this. And they cut that aspect off. And then automatically so many other things come on, right? The hijab comes on, the beard gets grown out, they start following the sunnah, they're showing up at the masjid. And because the thing that was blocking the individual got removed, right? They became a zahid from that aspect of the dunya. And then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, they became connected with Allah. And so the people, this was the zuhd of the khawas. Imam Ahmad Hanbal was saying that they have zuhd from the zawaid, from the things which are extra. Meaning that, and there's some very stark examples of this. There was this one individual who would eat barley just raw, right, without mixing it with water. And someone asked the individual that, why do you do that? It's hard to digest, it's not easy to eat, it doesn't taste nice. At least you could soak the barley, make it into oatmeal, and then eat it. You can make a talbina or something like that. And he said, I calculated the amount of time that it takes for me to eat it like this, and the amount of time it takes me to um, what's that called, prepare the food. And in that much time I could do this much extra zikr. So I just save the time and put it towards my zikr. So this is zuhd from the zawaid. And then there's Imam Ibn Hanbal says that there's a third level of zuhd, which was the zuhd from what we call la ya'ni, from things which don't concern an individual. And the Prophet ﷺ, he said, "Min husn al-Islam al-mar'i tarkuhu ma la ya'ni," that from the beauty of a person's deen is to leave that which doesn't concern them. Right? These people are not chasing the news. These people are not trying to figure out what's going on in other people's lives. And if you really take this in another commentary, I had read somewhere that I think it was a Risala of Ibn Qayyim al-Jawzi, when he was talking about this same qawl of Imam Ahmad ibn Hanbal, and the way that he understood that was that la ya'ni is being disconnected, or anything that distracts from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is immaterial, right? It's vain, it's worthless. I mean, the only thing that matters, the only thing that has value is Allah. And everything else is just, like I said, la ya'ni. Another way that zuhd has been described is that you don't have your eyes on the mawjood, and you don't lament over the mafqood. Meaning that, whatever you have, people become, hyper possessive about it and hyper anxious about trying to preserve their wealth and preserve their lifestyle, preserve their reputation, preserve. So they're all focused on material things. They become very material, what we call maddi. And when a person becomes very grounded in materialism, it's very hard for them to become spiritual. And that people shouldn't lament over mafqood, meaning the thing that they missed, or the thing that they've lost. So you don't have a certain type of, you don't have a certain type of car, you didn't get into med school, whatever has missed you. Number one, we understand that whatever missed us, whatever we want, no matter how much we wanted, we could have never got it if it wasn't written for us. But people don't get this concept, and because of that, they don't have zuhd in this sense. They're always looking at what other people have. How come she has that? How come she got married to such and such person? And this creates hasad within individuals. It creates, this whole idea of keeping up with the Joneses. ألهاكم التكاثر حتى زرتم المقابر. Everyone's trying to get one leg up on everyone else. They want to, more dunya, more fame, more glamour, more attention, more tafawwuk, more station, a higher station than the person next door. And this type of mutual rivalry in the dunya, it never ends, right? If you think that you're trying to get the most beautiful girl, then your friend will get a person who's more beautiful than them. And if that person feels that he got someone beautiful, then there's someone else who's beautiful, more beautiful than that. وَفَوْقَ كُلِّ ذِي عِلْمٍ عَلِيمٍ. No matter how smart you are, or how many Harvard degrees you get, there's going to be someone out there who's going to be smarter than you. No matter how rich you are, there's someone who's going to be richer than you. And that's why Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala redirected ourselves from running on this hamster wheel of the dunya, where you feel like you're moving, but you're actually not going anywhere. And redirected us to take this innate propensity that we have within ourselves to compete, and directed it towards the deen. تبارك الذي بيده الملك وهو على كل شيء قدير الذي خلق الموت والحياة ليبلوكم يعني ليظهر, to make it manifest, أيكم أحسن عملا. In another verse, سابقوا إلى مغفرة من ربكم, that make musabaqa, right? Compete with each other, but why? To compete in what? Compete for the rahmah of your Lord. And don't compete in those things that are going to drive you far from the rahmah of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. In another narration, it comes that the Prophet ﷺ, he said, no, where is that narration? Oh, I had it somewhere. Don't want to misquote it. Yeah. The hadith is from Sahal ibn Sa'd al-Sa'idi radiyallahu ta'ala an. And he said, جاء رجل إلى النبي صلى الله عليه وسلم. A man came to the Prophet صلى الله عليه وسلم, and he said, فقال يا رسول الله. He said, O Messenger of Allah, دلني على عمل إذا عملته أحبني الله. That tell me about something, guide me towards something that if I do it, that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will love me. وَحَبَّنِي النَّاسِ, and that people will love me. So then he said, Izhad fi dunya yuhibbuk Allah. That have zuhd in the dunya, and then Allah will love you. Wazhud fima inda nas yuhibbuk nas. And then have zuhd with what is in the hands of people, what people have, and that people will love you. And I mean, this hadith is so deep. We could give an entire, bayan just on this hadith itself. But the first part is that, when you fill your heart, and when you attempt to fill your heart with the love of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and by doing so, removing the love of the dunya, before you can fill your heart, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's love is already becoming directed towards you. Because if you start walking towards Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, Ataitu harwala, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala comes hastening towards that individual. That's why in the Quran, when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala talks about those who love, you, وَالَّذِينَ آمَنُوا أَشَدُّ يُحِبُّونَهُمْ وَيُحِبُّونَهُ, that he talks first about his love towards individuals, and then he talks about individuals' love towards him, because his love takes musabaqa, right? He wins out. We can never compete with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in how he loves us more than we love ourselves. And he actually tries to save us from ourselves. That's why he gave us the deen. It wasn't, this deen wasn't sent on us to give us a hard time, to make our lives miserable. It wasn't a set of rules. It was a set as a salvation. It was sent to show us how to live a peaceful life, how to live a blissful life here and in the akhirah. So when a person has zuhd in the dunya, and they turn their eyes away from the dunya and turn it towards Allah, the person gains the love of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And then the second part, they have zuhd with what people have. Stop salivating over what other people have. Stop running after people. Stop caring about what people think about you. And this is one of the things I guess I learned very early on in my life, that if you want to be one of the cool kids in high school, you got to stop caring about being cool. You got to just be yourself. You have to be comfortable in your own skin. And when we live in a generation of plastic Barbie dolls, and thin veneers, where people have cared so much about creating personas based on other people's perception of them, that they forget what they themselves are, then that's really a sad loss, because in the process of trying to please people lose themselves. But if you just leave that alone, right, and you just seek the love of Allah, and don't care about what people think, then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala himself will automatically spread the love of that individual amongst mankind. And the ultimate example of that is the Prophet alayhi salatu wasalam. Look, there's no person in the history of mankind who's been loved the way that the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam has been loved. So the proof is, in the pudding, as they say. Ibn Rajab Hanbali, he said that Zuhud is of three aspects. And all of these three aspects are actions which exist within the heart. And so, one of the things that he said is that you take and believe that what is with Allah is closer to your grasp than that which is in your hands. Meaning, and this is an understanding, in a more tasawwuf tradition of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala being fa'ala haqiqi, that Allah's in lillahi khaza'inu samawati wal ard, that the treasures of the heaven and the earth are in Allah's hands. The person who is in control is Allah. The person who owns is Allah. The person who adjudicates is Allah. The person who decides is Allah. And the person who owns is Allah. When we say Maliki Yawmiddin, it doesn't mean that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is Malik only on that day. He's always Malik. But on that day, there'll be no one to vie with him being a Malik. Ayn al-mutakabbirun, ayn al-jabbarun. Where are your big people? Where are those people who used to get big in the dunya? There's no one who's going to stand up on that day. But that doesn't detract from the idea that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is always a Malik. And if he is the ultimate person, he is mateen, he is the one who provides, he is the person of quwwah, he is an impenetrable fortress, he is Al-Aziz and Al-Jabbar, he is Al-Mutakabbir, then a person should rely on what is with Allah, because nothing is with us and everything in actuality is in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's hands. We don't own anything. Whatever we have, this is just an amana from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. If Allah, we don't even own our own hearts. Ya muqallib al-qulub, thabbit qulubana ala dinik. If Allah subhanahu the heart of an individual is between the two fingers of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He can turn it anywhere He wants. If He wants hidayah for an individual, the person will come to hidayah. If Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala desires for that person to, or has destined that individual to not have hidayah, that person will never have hidayah. مَن يُضْلِلِ اللَّهُ فَلَا هَادِيَ لَهُ وَمَن يَهْدِ اللَّهُ فَلَا مُضِلَّ لَهُ وَمَن يُضْلِلِ اللَّهُ فَلَا هَادِيَ لَهُ. If Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala guides someone, there's no one who can misguide him. And if Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala misguides an individual, there's no one who can guide him. If Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala takes something from an individual, He can never get it back. And if Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala gives something to an individual, then the person can never, no one can ever take it away from that individual. And when a person has that yaqeen, that, and more yaqeen, what is with Allah is more than what is with in our own hands, that's one of the aspects of zuhud. The second aspect of zuhud is that the state when a person is hit with a musibah or a difficulty is the same as when a person is not hit with a difficulty or a calamity. Meaning that there's equanimity fi sarra'i wal dharra, that whether they're in good times or bad times, it's equal upon them. And in a very famous story of Sheikh Abdul Qadir Jilani, that one time a person came to him and he said, Sheikh, there was a big, your big, load was coming on the ship with all the goods and the, from trade, and perhaps even his son was on the ship, and news got to us that that ship was destroyed. And the sheikh, he was quiet for a little while. He looked at himself and he said, Alhamdulillah. And then after a little while, the individual came back and he told the sheikh, he said, Sheikh, hey, great news. It wasn't your ship, it was someone else's ship. And then he kept also quiet for a little while. And then he said, Alhamdulillah. No, people were really confused. They said, in that situation, you said, Alhamdulillah. In this situation, you said, Alhamdulillah. How could that be? And he said, the first time you came and told me that, I looked into my heart to see if there was any change. And when I saw that there was no change, I praised Allah. And the second time you gave me news that that was someone else's ship, and not, I hadn't lost my wealth and my family. I looked and saw if there was any change, and I saw that there wasn't, and I said Alhamdulillah. وَلَا تَحْزَنُوا عَلَى مَا فَاتَكُمْ, that they do not grieve over that thing that which has missed you. وَلَا تَفْرَحُوا بِمَا أَتَاكُمْ, and don't become overly exultant and happy over that thing that reaches you. And then the last aspect that Ibn Rajab mentions about Zuhud, he said that it's indifferent whether or not a person praises you or criticizes you with the truth. And this is something that people can't take anymore. I mean, we're a nation of nasiha. People can't take to be corrected. As soon as you say anything to people, people are paper thin. They want to cancel you. You say something, they're like, don't judge me. It's only Allah's job to judge me. Well, I'm not being your judge. There's something in the deen which is actually wajib, which is called Amr bil Ma'ruf wa Nahy al Munkar, and that is ordaining good and forbidding evil. That we have to be a community that does this for each other and saves each other and corrects each other. So people try to, they're not honest with themselves, and they're so dishonest with themselves, and then they can promulgate this idea and hide behind this veneer of, oh, you can't judge me. No one's judging you. No one's saying that you're a good person or a bad person. But if you're going to drink alcohol and say that, don't tell me don't drink alcohol, it's between me and Allah, well, no, you shouldn't drink alcohol, right? If you're missing salah and someone says, should tell you that, you should not, you should be praying salah. And if a person corrects us, we should actually see this as a blessing of Allah, right? وَذَكِّرْ فَإِنَّ الذِّكْرَى تَنْفَعُ الْمُؤْمِنِينَ. And remind, because the reminder benefits the believer. And if the reminder of other individuals, reminders that come in our life, reminders that come from our parents, instead of saying, oh, stop giving me a lecture, reminders that comes from our friends, if those are not benefiting us, then we should be scared, because these things are so tanfa'ul mu'minin. They're supposed to. Then is there a problem with our iman, that we're not amongst true believers? The people who have a tremendous amount of taqwa, even when the criticism is not true, they still take it as a benefit, because it gives them a chance for self-reflection, right? And when you face the ego, then and are humble about it, then it's not a big deal. Fudayl ibn Ayad, he said that the essence of zuhud is to have ghina with Allah. Allah is Alhamdulillah ala ni'mat al-Islam wa kafa biha ni'ma, and one level even beyond that is Hasbunallah wa ni'mal wakil. Alaysa Allah bikafir abda? Isn't Allah enough from you? Right? What does a Lamborghini have on Allah? What does a mansion have on Allah? What does a 3-week vacation to Paris have on Allah? Alaysa Allah bikafin abda? Isn't Allah enough for you? And he further went on to say that being having ghina is zuhd, and being content, rida. And it is also ghina, it is also richness. Al-ghina, ghina al-qalb. For whoever has full yaqeen in Allah, that person will have tawakkul in Allah with all of his matters. And he'll be happy with whatever Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala decides to handle his affairs. And when a person submits to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in this way, then he's cutting out any attachment with creation. So tomorrow, if he loses all his wealth, he says, Alhamdulillah, that's what Allah wanted. And tomorrow he becomes a millionaire, he says, okay, Alhamdulillah, that's what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala wanted. So he doesn't have any hope in creation. He doesn't have fear from creation. And this disconnection prevents him from trying to gain the dunya and accumulate the dunya. And the Prophet ﷺ talked about this, right? That if the son of Adam, if a person is afflicted with the disease of greed, this is a type of insatiable thirst that's never going to end, right? If you have a problem or addiction with porn, it doesn't end. It's one phase after another, after another, and after another, until you get into the grave. And if a person has an addiction with drugs, it's the same thing. And with alcohol, it's the same thing. And if it's with counting money and trying to get more money, it's the same thing. And if the son of Adam had a valley of gold, he would want 2. And if he had 2, he would have 4. And nothing will fill the stomach of the son of Adam except the dirt of the grave. That's what it comes down to. And so when a person gets cut from the creation of Allah and gets created and connected with the creator, and he stops chasing the dunya, right? Especially towards disliked means. That's what it means for a person to be zahid in the dunya. And this is the richest person on earth, even though he might not own anything, right? There's a funny story about an individual who was like lying on a beach, and a person comes to him and he says, what do you do for a living? Right? He's a big businessman, rich guy. And he was just some poor fisherman. He says, oh, I fish. And he says, so what? He said, that's all you do? You just fish for a living? He said, yeah. And I go in the morning, I catch a few fish, I sell them in the market, and then, that's how I make money. He said, well, why don't you take some of that money that you get from selling those fish to buy a better rod? And he said, what will I do with that? He says, well, then you can catch more fish. And he says, so why would I want to catch more fish? He said, because you can sell that, and with the money you can get a net. And if you get a net, then you'll catch more fish. And with that, you can make more money. And then you can get a boat. And so they go back and forth in many, many iterations. They said, what can I do with that? He said, oh, you can get a, ocean liner, and then you can do, aquaculture, and then you'll be, super rich. And he said, okay, so what am I going to do with all that money? He says, then you can just relax and just lie on the beach. And he says, what do you think I'm doing now? Right. And so that's this idea of just being rich about and being happy about wherever Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala put you in life. Right. That's a true sign of zuhud. Um, and that's why Imam Ahmad bin Hanbal, he also said that a sign of zuhud is that your wealth, that if your wealth is increased or decreased, it doesn't make you happy or sad. It's just whatever. Um, and it's interesting to note that many people, the nafs is always going to extremes. So people generally fall on the side of wanting dunya and stuff, but it's actually the nafs also goes sometimes to the opposite side, right, where it goes to the extreme. You have some people who are very given to privations, and deprivation. They want to become Navy SEALs. They want to push their body to weird type of things, right? And um, that's also a type of attachment with the dunya, because again you're chasing a feeling. um and that's why it said that those people who are the foremost, sabiqun samiqun, the people who are foremost in doing good deeds, there are two types. There's some individuals who only take what is necessary from this life, meaning they only take as much as you needed to get by, the very, very least. And you even see some non-Muslims like that, right? Some of these Hindu gurus, they do really weird things. They'll keep their hand up for 50 years as a sign of trying to control their nafs, and a sign of their love for God, and these type of things. And they eat very little, sleep very little, to extremes. And then there's those individuals that take what they need, mean the bare necessities of life, but they also enjoy some aspects of the worldly life to give them strength to carry on. Meaning they um, they don't completely cut themselves off from the dunya as well. And that's a more difficult position to be in, to walk that middle way. It's easier, even though it may seem difficult, to become a monk in a monastery somewhere in Italy, where you never get married and you're celibate and so on and so forth. It's easier, for example, to fast every single day and only eat 3 dates for 40 years than it is to carry the Som Dawood, which is to fast one day and to break it the other day, and not to fast the other day, because then the nafs is completely under control. And they said the Prophet ﷺ was in the second category of individuals, because he used to be from the type of, he used to, in one hadith, right, he says that from the things of the dunya, the things that he used to like were women, perfume, and جُعِلَ قُرَّةُ عَيْنِي فِي الصَّلَاةِ كما قال, and the coolness of his eyes was in the salah. And the Sahaba were like this. By and large, they also lived life. قُلْ مَنْ حَرَّمَ زِينَةَ اللَّهِ الَّتِي أَخْرَجَ لِعِبَادِهِ وَالطَّيِّبَاتِ مِنَ الرِّزْقِ. There are some exceptions even amongst the Sahaba. There was people like Abu Dhar al-Ghafari, who was so zahid in a sense, right, in the sort of traditional sense, the way that we think about it, that he would go along to Sahaba and say, you can't keep any wealth for tomorrow, you need to give it all away. And actually in the time of Uthman radiallahu anh, they actually had to make him live outside the town, because it wasn't a sustainable model for the rest of humanity, right? Um, so it is actually in some ways wrong, and it's not from praiseworthy zuhud to completely detach yourself from the dunya, because that's also a cop out. That's also a scapegoat. The way is the middle way. So the person who's zahid, he might have money, he might not have money. He might be uber rich, and there were people like this. Uthman radiallahu anh was extremely rich. Imam Abu Hanifa at one point had a tremendous amount of wealth, but when someone came and saw everything that he had, and he said, Sheikh, what's all of this? I said, oh, you like it? Take half. And people, when he would see people from the family of the Prophet ﷺ, he would give so much that those people would feel shy to take. Right? He would just give so freely, because he had it, he didn't have it, it didn't really matter. They kept their money in their pocket, not in their hearts. And when they say that, when it comes to wealth, if it's subjugated to you, it's ni'm al-khadim, what a good servant it is. But if it is in charge of you, it's a sayyid, what a terrible sayyid, what a terrible boss it is. um, So these were a couple of words about Zuhd, but I want to also expand this from, the way, again, that sometimes people traditionally or stereotypically think about the Zahid, right? They think about the person with some disheveled hair and, he has only one cup and he's, eats very little. The person came to Imam Muhammad, and this is really at the heart of what Zuhud is, that he came to Imam Muhammad and he said that, you've written, Imam Muhammad, this was Shaybani, the student of Imam Hanifa, one of the most prominent students of Imam Hanifa. And he said that, you wrote so many kitabs. Um, why didn't you write a kitab of Zuhud? Why didn't you write about Zuhud? And he said, I did. He said, I wrote Kitabul Buyu. And what he meant by that, Kitabul Buyu is the book of financial transactions, meaning that the way, if you live your life every single day trying to make sure that you don't disobey Allah down to the smallest aspects of your life, even your financial transactions or what you charge on your card or how you charge your card, that is Zuhud. And you look at Imam Abu Hanifa. One time he borrowed money from an individual, and he met someone else, and they were walking, and it was hot outside. So he said, "Why don't you come and stand with me in the shade?" And so he said, "No, I can't come and stand with you in the shade." He said, "Why not?" He said that this shade is from the covering of the store of the individual that I borrowed the money from, and I don't want any semblance of riba, in my transaction. So, in that sense, living a life of taqwa, living a life of self discipline, living a sinless life, this is the life of zuhud. And the closer you get to the sunnah, that's how much of a zahid you are. There's actually 6 signs of a zahid that have been written about. Number one, they said moderation in expenditure or in spending, right? That no, ولا تبسطها كل البسط فتقعد ملوما محصورا. Uh, uh, that don't keep it as if it was tied to your neck. ولا تبسطها كل البسط فتقعد ملوما, and don't spend it all openly, freely, and then you sit like blameworthy. Like, you go to the UAF fundraiser and you cleaned out your bank account, and then now you have to ask someone for money tomorrow. That's not zuhd, right? That was immoderate. But you don't want to be so tight, tight-handed that you can't spend on your family, that you don't spend on in the path of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. You don't need a new car, you want a new car, but you're like, you know what, I can get, this car is fine. What's the big deal? Let me help this particular cause. Let me help the poor Muslims in Yemen or whatever the case may be. So this is moderation expenditure. And number two, they say don't seek leadership. Um, don't try to be the person who's giving the khutbah or the president of MSA or any of these other things. Number three, having moderation in your appearance, right? And this is one of the problems that people, especially you live in such a superficial society, people care way too much about their looks. And being zahid doesn't mean that you look like trash, right? And your hair is all over and you never, comb your hair. The Prophet took care of himself, and he was neat and clean, but he wasn't vain. And people are too full of themselves, and they're just chasing. Everyone's trying to be a model. Everyone's trying to be GQ. That's not moderation in appearance. The next one they say is not to be around people too much. Don't always be trying to hang out, always eating out, always having fun, always chilling. You need to spend some time around people. Go to a masjid, say salam alaikum salam. Don't try to avoid people completely and be a complete introvert, but don't overdo it on the other side. The fifth characteristic is the person controls their desire. And then the sixth thing is that they have moderation, that which does not concern Allah. Meaning that, if it's not about Islam and it's not about deen, they're not like all about that. Right? I mean, so yes, maybe sometimes they might take a vacation, maybe they'll take a stroll in the park, but that's not what they really invest in. They really invest in Allah, they invest in their deen. And so there's a zuhud that exists in a practical sense in every aspect of our life, right? And there should be a zuhud in our food. Ramadan is coming around the corner, meaning you should eat whatever you get gratefully. Some people are no, they even say this. They say, I'm a foodie, right? If you're a foodie, you're not zahid. Um, you just eat whatever comes on the plate. Some people say that, oh, if it's not tasty enough, they just don't eat, right? Because they can't take it. They're just spoiled. The Zahid doesn't really care. And this is something that you saw with the Prophet ﷺ. He never criticized food. Whatever he eat, right? Bismillah, you eat it. And after it, Alhamdulillah, alladhi at'amana wa saqana wa ja'alana min al-muslimin. They didn't run behind tasty food. They weren't looking and scouring the net for how do I find a Michelin chef in my area so I can go and eat at that particular restaurant. um, there should be zuhd in clothing, right? I mean, some sisters they're like, I need to get my clothing such that no one has my level of style, right? I got it all put together. Zuhd in clothing meaning that you should wear clean clothes, right? That's it. And just be normal in your clothes. That's a certain level of zuhd, and this zuhd goes a long way when it comes to the deen. And Abdullah ibn Mas'ud, he actually said this to the Tabi'een. He told the Tabi'een, he said, you pray more, you fast more, and you do more jihad than the Sahaba of the Prophet ﷺ. But he said they were better than you. So the Tabi'een were like, how could that be? You're praying more, you're fasting more, you're doing more jihad, but the Sahaba were better than you? He said that they were azhad fi dunya mink. They had more zuhud in the dunya than you, and they were more hopeful in the hereafter than you. The Prophet ﷺ, he said in another riwayah that whoever makes the dunya their preoccupation, then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will place his poverty in front of his eyes, and he'll make his affairs scattered, shatta, and nothing of the dunya comes to him except that which has been decreed for them. But whoever is running instead makes the hereafter their preoccupation, right? That what is it? Zuhud hirfati, right? The zuhud is my occupation, it's my job. But whoever makes the hereafter their preoccupation, then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala places freedom from want in his heart, and he gathers that person's affairs. And the dunya comes to him despite him being reluctant to do so. And it's really this a similitude is like that of a person's shadow. If the dunya is like your shadow, if you run behind it, you can never catch it. But if you turn around and run the other way, it'll come behind you. If a person's heart is going to be full of love of the dunya, one of the things that you'll see is that you will find it very hard to cry. It'll be hard to drop even one tear, even if you're standing at Arafah at the Hajj. And if a person finds themselves in that situation, then they really need to make some muhasabah, right? They need to take back and say, how do I cleanse my heart and how do I become zahid? Because the person who has zuhd has their eye on the prize. They have their eye on the akhirah. And Ibn Taymiyyah, that's why he said that zuhd is to leave that thing that doesn't benefit you in the akhirah. Um, and Abdullah ibn Mubarak was one of the great tabi'een. One time a person called to him and he said, "O Zahid," right? "O Zahid." And he said, "Are you talking to me?" He said, "I'm not a Zahid." He said, "The real Zahid is Omar bin Abdul Aziz." He said, and the reason he said that is he said, I didn't have that much to give up, right? He was maybe poor to begin with. I didn't have to change. Abdullah ibn Umar bin Abdul Aziz, he was the Khalifa. He had all that wealth. The dunya was at his feet and he gave it up. So if you want to become Zahid, it requires change. It requires sacrifice. Um, and so if you can make that decision, right? If you can make that decision to make a change with Ramadan around the corner, if you can, using Ramadan as a catapult and a catalyst, if you can make that change, then today you're a Zahid. اللهم اجعلنا منهم وآخر دعوانا أن الحمد لله رب العالمين.
Jazakallah khair, Sheikh Omar. It's a very beautiful talk. I saw a brother dropped a dua in the chat box, and he was asking for a comment on it. I'm assuming in a way if it relates to Zuhud or if this is a good dua for someone wanting to, be more of a zahid that they should say, or if you have any other du'as you would suggest to increase
So
ourselves in that way.
there's one narration that comes to the towards the meaning of كما قال رسول الله كاد الفقر أن يكون كفرا, that there is some type of poverty that it draws nigh to leading a person to kufr. And this is something that, so we seek refuge from that type of poverty. On the same time, there's many ahadith which come and show the fadila of poverty. So, for example, the fuqara will enter into Jannah 500 years. The poor people will enter into Jannah 500 years before the people who are wealthy. So clearly, they have their own virtues of being poor. Um, so it really depends on where a person is in their life, right? If a person, um, for the vast majority of people, this is a dua to make. Allahumma a'udhu bika min kufri wal faqr, because for the vast majority of people, if they become poor, our iman is so weak that people will very quickly be ready to go to illicit means and haram means to make up the difference. We just don't have that type of strength and that type of tawakkul anymore. So this is probably appropriate dua to make, that we safe, we make seek refuge from kufr and faqr. And then we should simultaneously also make the dua that, Ya Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, grant us wealth, but grant us also the heart to spend that wealth in your path in a way that is pleasing to you. Don't make it a distraction from us from the akhirah. Make it, and because this also comes, and that one of the people that we've been told that you can have a ghibta about is the person who's been given wealth and then they spend it, in the path of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And this is one of the things that Sahaba, actually the poor Sahaba told the Prophet, I'm like, we can't catch up with these people. And the Prophet says, I'm like, there's a longer exchange, but in the end, ذَلِكَ فَضْلُ اللَّهِ يُؤْتِيهِ مَن يَشَاءُ. There's not much you can do about it. Right? This is a special blessing Allah gave those people. Allah blessed them in that, and that's the case. But for us, we just the main thing is to ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to remove, not necessarily asking for faqr, but asking for removal of that attachment to that wealth, right? So yeah, you could live in a mansion, but if something happens and you have to sleep on the floor, okay, fine, right? So a person, you don't want to become so spoiled that when it comes time for itikaf, you're like, oh, I can't go for itikaf because there's not clean bathrooms there or something like. I mean, we're lose. That's the attachment that you want to remove. The things that stop us from getting closer to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. That makes sense.
Jazakallah khair. We also have another question from Brother Abdullah Atallah. He's going to ask it on the mic, inshallah. Zaid, you might have to unmute him.
There we go. All right. You can hear me guys now, right?
Yes, mashallah.
Yes. I had a question regarding that. It's a very interesting topic, and I've been thinking about it for a long time before this day too. So my problem is I have a problem committing to my obligations without taking advantage of my natural driving mechanisms. That I feel like even Allah Himself uses these driving mechanisms to draw me closer to Him, which is love and fear, right? Targhib and tarhib. So if I am to be completely detached, which I constantly try, then how am I going to get anything done? Like, I feel like I can't even work on an assignment if I don't fear missing the deadline or I'm not excited about getting a good grade. And so I feel like attachment is necessary to function in modern society.
Sure.
And I mean, I don't need attachment to find food, for example, of course,
Right.
but I can't function in modern society if all I have is